Hello, everyone, and welcome to Botanical Naming Strategies in Woleaian, a remote methods analysis. My name is Emma Breslow. I want to begin by respectfully acknowledging the kuleana of the Hawaiian people to these lands on which I work and live, lands which were ceded under duress. I extend that respect to the Indigenous, Native, and First Nations peoples from whose lands you may virtually be joining me today. I further recognize that past, present, and future generations of Indigenous Hawaiians and their knowledge systems all shape the lands of Hawaii. A bit of outline for my project. I'll start with some background, talk about the methods that I use, the qualitative and quantitative results, and last discuss. So, to begin with, Woleaian is a Micronesian language of the Chuukic subfamily. It's spoken in the Federated States of Micronesia on Eauripik Atoll and Woleai. I was introduced to this language and to the speakers Lenny Saumar and Carter Mongier through a hybrid field methods course. Both of these speakers are from Eauripik Atoll but now live on Oahu in Hawaii. Eauripik Island itself, as you can see in this image, is very small, less than a tenth of a square mile. This is important to point out because it makes for an interesting point of comparison between other ethnobotanical studies and this one, where there's comparatively smaller island and lower plant diversity. Part of the lack of diversity is because Eauripik has had a number of storms come through over the years, and some of these have wiped out most of the plants, and they have had to be brought back to the island either naturally or by humans. Nonetheless, I wanted to give you a bit of a sense of what the island looks like. There are 5 main landscapes, or mini biomes, if you will, one being the outer area outside, and then there's the reef, the beach, the inland area in general, and the garden, farms, more cultivated area on the island. This project was done remotely due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but the aims of the study were to contribute to language documentation and ethnobotanical literature in general and on Woleaian, to try out remote methodology for such an ethnobotanical study where we're talking about plants that we can't actually physically access for the most part, and to create a botanical field guide for the Woleaian community. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about doing linguistics and ethnobotany together. Part of the reason for this is that linguistic diversity and biodiversity have been shown in a number of studies to be very intricately connected. So, for example, when you're in a situation of language shift where a language might be threatened, very often there's also a connection with biological diversity and climate change threatening that. There's also been a lot of work, especially by Ong Si 2011, talking about how doing these two types of research together can really only enrich both of them. My study, because I am focusing on those names of plants, is largely focused on Berlin 1992, who looked at cultivation status of plants when looking at how these plants are named. He divided things into 3 main naming strategies: plants which have semantically opaque names, semi-transparent names, and transparent names. Here, semantically opaque names would be something like English for oak, where oak means an oak tree, but there's no more information we can get from the name oak itself. It is opaque to us. Semi-transparent would be something like red oak, but we know that red has some meaning. It's telling us something about the oak, but oak itself is still opaque. And lastly, something like poison ivy would be transparent, where it's telling us what the plant looks like and what potentially might happen if we interact with it. Now, Berlin 1992 found that the opacity of names tends to increase with the cultural significance of that plant, and he connected cultural significance with how people interact with the plant. If it's cultivated, it's highly culturally significant. If it's protected, where if it's found, it's not removed, it's still fairly significant. If it's grown wild, but people use it, then it's going to be significant, whereas if they don't use it, it's going to be not treated or less significant. This leads to my main question for the study, which are what strategies are used to name plants in Woleaian, and how does cultivation status correlate with these strategies? In terms of my methodology, the project was not conducted on Eauripik. As I said, it was mostly conducted on Oahu. Many of the sessions took place over Zoom, but even when we were meeting in person, most of the plants we were talking about were not physically available on Oahu. I collected the Woleaian names of all of these plants, of course, but I also attempted to collect the English and scientific names when the plants were identifiable, as well as descriptions, uses, and other culturally relevant information like that. I also collected photos for each plant, taking them myself when I was able to, and otherwise finding open source images, following the guidelines of Baskoff and Kirchhoff, who talk about how to take photos of plants that will be most helpful for identification. So here you can see a papaya, you can see I have an image of the whole tree, an image of the flowers, and an image of the fruit. In terms of how we actually found plants to talk about when they weren't physically present, I started by bringing up plants that I was familiar with from Oahu and thought might be on Eauripik. From there, we went through lists of Micronesian plants from other sources and used things like Google Images and iNaturalist to look at the plants together and go through images to help trigger memory or confirm that we were talking about the same plant. I also used free listing based on March in 1995, where I would ask the speakers, okay, think about plants that grow inland and are good for eating. List all of them, everything that comes to mind. Or plants that are good for firewood. List all of them. This is very useful for triggering memory to think about more plants and also to get a little bit of information about what plants are good for what. Similarly, I used landscape descriptions where I would ask my speakers in Woleaian to describe a landscape like the beach. Imagine you're on the beach in Eauripik. What plants and animals do you see there? This gives more linguistically rich data and also more opportunities for my speakers to remember some of the plants. Now, in terms of that cultivation status by Berlin that I mentioned, I use an adapted method of his sorting task using Google Jamboard, which is like an online whiteboard. And so I use those 4 quadrants where you see cultivated plants, protected plants, useful wild plants, and the remaining category of less useful wild plants. And so my speakers were given this top image here where there were 4 quadrants and all the photos of plants were initially in the middle. And together, because it's a virtual whiteboard, they were able to move those images around collaboratively, the 2 speakers, to decide, is this plant cultivated, is it protected, useful wild plant, or a remaining wild plant. In the end, I collected around 128 plant names, as well as those relevant descriptions, uses of the plant, images, sorting task results, and historical linguistic information about each one. I have 3 main angles of analysis here. One is qualitatively figuring out what the naming strategies are for these plant names, looking at morphological analysis for each term, and looking at the results of those category sorting tasks. In terms of the naming strategies, I have 3 main ones here. So loanwords like tomato, loanword from English, characteristics where the name of the plant describes something about what the plant looks like. So here, perang is marigold, where pe means flower and rang means yellowy orange. Affordances are how that plant can be used. So the bottom image there is of Senna alata with the yellow flowers. That's in Woleaian tamwisi, which is both the word for this plant and the word for ringworm because this plant can be used to treat ringworm. So the name of the plant is saying something about how the plant can be used. And lastly, I had an other category which was largely unanalyzable things like ne for coconut, were similar to the English opaque term oak. It just means oak. There's no real way to break it down, or it doesn't have any other meaning. Moving now to my morphological analysis, you can see that about 25% of the terms overall were multimorphemic. And most of those multimorphemic ones, the ones in teal, were either categorized into characteristic space names or affordance space names. About 52% of plant terms fall into that other category of being unanalyzable. And this is quite high compared to Berlin. Blake 2024 summed that Berlin found about a third of the plants were in that other category or unanalyzable category. One idea that I have for why this is so much higher might be because the island is so small and the botanical diversity on the island is small enough that people have fewer plants they need to remember. That smaller cognitive load might mean that they can use more opaque terms or unanalyzable terms than a different community could because they have fewer plants overall to remember, and those opaque terms have a higher cognitive load. Another idea I had is that the distinction between what is a cultivated plant and what is a wild plant on Eauripik might be less strong than in other places. One reason I have to believe this is, for example, I was talking with one of my speakers once about Barringtonia or fish poison tree, and this is a wild plant that's not really used for anything, but he was still able to say, oh yeah, that there are 3 of them on the island and they grow in these specific places, despite them not being useful and despite him not having been to Eauripik in many years. So it suggests that there's more knowledge of wild plants and what's going on the island than there might be on a larger island or a place with more botanical diversity. Moving now to the results of the sorting task, here you can see those 4 pre-established categories of remaining plants, protected plants, cultivated plants, and useful wild plants, and the 4 naming strategies of loanwords, characteristics-based names, affordance-based names, and that other or unanalyzable category. You can see that most of the loanwords are cultivated or useful wild plants. The fact that there are so many loanwords being used for wild plants also kind of supports my idea that that distinction between what is cultivated and wild is perhaps less strong on Eauripik, because we would expect that loanwords would often come from plants that were brought intentionally to the island. Moving to the characteristics, you can see that the vast majority of them are wild plants, either useful wild or remaining wild plants. This matches with Berlin's prediction that semantically transparent names, such as those that describe the characteristics of a plant, are more common in less culturally significant plants, which he equates with wild plants. Similarly, with affordances, these would also be more transparent terms, and we can see that many of them are wild plants. However, many of them are also cultivated plants, which goes against Berlin's prediction because those would be more culturally significant plants. My idea for this is perhaps that when you have a cultivated plant, it's generally useful, and so it might make sense to name it after how it is used or what affordances it has. Lastly, looking at that other category, you can see that the majority of these are useful wild plants, which also goes against Berlin's predictions, but could again be explained if that distinction between what's cultivated and wild is less strong on Eauripik. So, I would like to talk a little bit about how my methods went. I do want to acknowledge that doing all these things, meeting over Zoom, using that Google Whiteboard, virtual whiteboard, all of this relies on everyone involved having access to technology skills, reliable internet, things like that. It's also worth noting that because I was only talking to a few speakers, I was relying on their memory. They were not on Eauripik when we were doing this study, as well as any idiosyncrasies they might have in how they think about plants. Partially because of those technological requirements, I had challenges connecting with other members of the community to get a broader picture. And it's of course worth mentioning that for the most part, we were not working with physical plant specimens, which makes it much more difficult to make confident identifications of these plants. That said, this method still seems to be a good alternative due to COVID or other restrictions. It avoids the carbon footprint of travel and is a thing you can do if you cannot actually go to the place you're studying. That Eauripik is actually quite difficult to get to because it is so remote in some ways from main transportation routes. And so that may be one reason that I was able to find this interesting information about how the island size and the species diversity might be important factors to consider when doing this sort of research. I suggest that having a smaller overall cognitive load due to botanical diversity might affect the ways that people are able to name plants, as well as potentially having a weaker distinction between what is a cultivated plant and wild plant might affect the more universal things we would expect to see when doing this kind of research. With that, here are my references, and thank you very much. I welcome any questions. I'm happy to talk more about some of these smaller categories of naming strategies that I found as well, such as metaphors and words that talk about where the plant comes from, if there are questions about those, or anything else. Thank you very much.